There were moments in the Second World War when the fate of nations shifted not because of massive fleets or sweeping battlefield victories, but because a single threat cast a shadow across entire oceans. In the eyes of the United States, one such threat was the German battleship Tirpitz. She was a steel monster that did not need to fire a single shot at an American ship to influence the war. Her presence alone reshaped American strategy and forced supply routes to bend around danger. To American planners, she was more than a warship. She was a silent pressure on the Arctic convoys that carried American weapons, fuel, aircraft, trucks, food, and ammunition to the Soviet Union. If that lifeline ever broke, the Eastern Front would weaken and the war would stretch far longer. The United States understood this risk. America was fighting on two continents in those years, and the loss of the Arctic supply chain would be a blow felt across the entire Allied effort. In the early autumn of 1943, Tirpitz waited in the icy channels of northern Norway. The ship rested deep inside Kaafjord, surrounded by mountains that rose like cold walls over dark water. Camouflage nets hung from the mast to the rocky shoreline. The nets blended her outline with the granite cliffs and drifting snow. German guards walked the deck with confidence as cold winds swept across the fjord. They believed no enemy could reach this place. The battleship stretched close to 900 feet from bow to stern. Her armored towers rose above the mist like metal cliffs. Anti-torpedo nets guarded every approach. Hydrophone stations listened for movement under the water. Patrol boats drifted in slow patterns, their searchlights sweeping across the quiet surface. To the German sailors who watched the fjord, Kaafjord felt like a natural fortress, and Tirpitz felt untouchable. In Washington and in London, analysts studied the same ship with a different understanding. Tirpitz had become a choke point that held back Allied strategy. She forced American convoys to take longer routes through waters filled with submarines. She pinned down Allied battleships that would otherwise support operations elsewhere. Even without leaving her anchorage, she dictated the movements of American cargo and threatened the survival of the Eastern Front. American planners recognized a harsh truth. If the Arctic supply line failed, the Soviet front would weaken, and American soldiers would pay the price in later campaigns. Something had to be done. Air attacks had failed because German smoke generators filled the fjord with thick clouds that blinded bombers. Large submarines could not pass through the nets. Surface ships could not survive the coastal guns. The solution no longer rested in size or firepower. It needed to be something small enough to slip beneath defenses and strong enough to cripple a giant. The plan that followed was unlike anything attempted before. It called for miniature submarines to travel deep into enemy waters and place explosive charges directly below the armored belly of the Tirpitz. It was a mission built on stealth, precision, and desperation. It was a mission that the United States needed to succeed. The plan became known as Operation Source. It was a mission that depended on tiny submarines called X-class craft. Each vessel measured slightly over 50 feet from end to end. The crew of 4 men worked inside a narrow steel tube filled with pipes and equipment. The air inside the submarine was damp and heavy. Condensation dripped from every surface. The men worked in darkness for long periods and navigated by listening to the water around them. The X-class carried 2 explosive charges that could be released beneath a target and left on the seabed. These charges each weighed close to 2 tons and held enough power to bend armored plates. British engineers built the craft. American intelligence supported the planning. The mission served the needs of the entire Allied effort, and especially the needs of the United States that depended on the Arctic convoy route. Training for the operation took place in the cold waters of northern Scotland. The volunteers learned to navigate by instruments alone. They practiced slipping under barriers and steering through underwater obstacles. The men spent hours inside the cramped submarine as water pressure caused the hull to tremble. Silence filled the interior except for the faint hum of equipment. The volunteers learned to feel every vibration and memorize the sounds of the ocean around them. Many suffered from exhaustion as drills continued day and night. Others endured the closed air and the fear of getting trapped. Week after week, the crews built enough skill to attempt the most dangerous underwater mission conceived in the war. When the crews were ready, large British submarines towed the miniature craft across the rough waters of the North Sea. The journey stretched over several days as waves crashed over the towing vessels. Storms struck without warning. The tiny X-class submarines were pulled through the water like fragile containers. The towing cables groaned under the pressure. The metal plates on the X-craft shook violently. Water seeped through joints that were never meant to withstand such pounding. Inside the cramped hulls, the men tried to rest, but sleep was nearly impossible. Condensation dripped from pipes. Battery fumes mixed with the cold air. The crew rotated positions and wiped moisture from gauges as the sea continued to batter their small craft. During one violent swell, disaster occurred. One of the X-class submarines broke free from its tow. The cable snapped with a sharp crack and the vessel pitched forward. It sank within seconds. The towing crew could only watch as the craft disappeared into the darkness. There was no time to attempt a rescue. The sea swallowed the submarine and its crew without leaving a trace. The remaining submariners felt the weight of the loss, but continued toward the Norwegian coast. They knew that more danger lay ahead. They understood the stakes. American convoys depended on their success in ways that could not be measured by distance alone. The crew reached the jagged coastline of Norway. The mountains rose sharply from the water. Narrow channels cut through the cliffs like ancient wounds carved by glaciers. Sunlight faded early in the day, and shadows covered the water. The submarines drifted free of their towing vessels and advanced on their own power. Electric motors hummed softly. The water grew colder with each passing mile. Pressure built against the hulls and the steel walls creaked. Inside the submarines, the air turned colder. Frost formed on metal fittings. The men moved carefully through their compartments, listening to the faint echoes of underwater life while their breath fogged in the heavy air. The first barrier came into view beneath the water. It was a massive anti-submarine net built of steel mesh. The net stretched from one side of the fjord to the other. Chains anchored it deep into the seabed. Mines floated along its length like silent guards waiting for movement. Above the surface, German patrol boats drifted slowly. Their searchlights moved in sweeping arcs across the water. German sailors stood with calm expressions. They believed the fjord could not be penetrated. They believed that no submarine could slip through the defenses. They trusted the nets and the mountains that surrounded them. One X-class submarine moved closer to the barrier. The commander studied the mesh through the dim lights of the periscope. A narrow opening appeared near one of the anchor chains. It was barely wide enough for the small craft to pass. The commander ordered a slow descent. The submarine brushed against the steel mesh. The hull vibrated. The sound echoed through the interior. The crew held their breath as they waited for a reaction from the guards above. For a moment, the submarine caught on the metal. Then, the commander adjusted the trim tanks. The submarine tilted slightly and slid downward. The steel mesh scraped against the hull before releasing its grip. The craft passed under the barrier and entered the inner approach. Another submarine followed through the same opening. The current pushed the vessel against the net, and the hull scraped loudly. A piece of equipment broke loose. The periscope housing cracked and glass shattered. The men inside kept their focus as they adjusted their depth. The submarine dipped into the narrow space under the net and emerged on the other side. The men knew the barrier had been the first major test. They also knew that more defenses lay ahead. Further behind, another crew attempted to reach Kaafjord, but mechanical failures forced them to abandon the mission. Their pumps and engines could not hold steady. Water began to seep into compartments. They scuttled the craft and waited for rescue. Another submarine faced battery trouble. Instruments flickered and air quality degraded. They could not continue. A separate submarine moved deeper into the fjord, but never reported again. Its fate remained unknown. Only 2 X-class submarines remained. These 2 would have to complete the mission alone. The last barrier was the strongest. A heavy inner net blocked the final approach. The steel mesh was thicker. Its chains were heavier. The water grew darker and colder. The pressure felt like a weight upon the submarine. One of the X-class submarines struck the net head-on. Instruments fell from their mounts. The crew held onto the interior railings as the submarine bounced back. The commander ordered a slow reverse. The craft backed away from the net and then descended toward the seabed. Rocks scraped along the hull. The submarine dipped under the lowest edge of the barrier and forced its way past the final ring of defenses. The second submarine approached the final barrier. Strong currents pushed the small vessel toward the rocks. The commander fought the controls as the hull vibrated with each impact. Water leaked through damaged seals. The crew wiped moisture from gauges and steadied their breathing. The submarine dipped under the last chains and drifted inside the inner anchorage. For a moment, the water fell silent. Both submarines had reached the interior of Kaafjord. Inside the fjord, darkness surrounded them. The water above grew lighter as the shape of the Tirpitz emerged. The massive battleship occupied the center of the fjord. Her hull blocked the faint glow from the surface. The X-class submarines drifted slowly under her shadow. The crew stared upward through the periscope tubes and saw only the dark outline of metal stretching across their view. The ship hovered above them like a steel mountain. The water around them felt colder and heavier as the presence of the giant ship suppressed all sound. The submarines crept toward their intended targets. One vessel moved toward the central section of the hull where the magazines and engine rooms were located. The commander guided the submarine across the seabed. The hull groaned under the pressure as he steered through silt and shadow. The second vessel drifted toward the stern of the ship. The men inside moved slowly and adjusted their depth with careful precision as they approached the propeller shafts and rudder assemblies. In the silent water, the crews prepared their explosive charges. They checked the release mechanisms and the timing devices. The men moved by touch. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. The commander of the first submarine released the forward charge. A heavy thud reverberated through the craft as the mine detached and fell to the seabed. The second charge followed soon after. The submarine drifted through silt as the charges settled into place under the central section of the ship. The second X-class submarine released its own charges under the stern compartments. The charges slipped downward and sank into the mud. The faint vibration of machinery inside the battleship could be felt through the water. The Tirpitz remained unaware. The charges were set. The mission had reached its point of no return. The two submarines drifted back into the darkness after releasing their charges. Inside the steel tubes, the crews felt the cold water pressing against the hull like a giant hand. They knew that the next moments would determine the fate of the ship above them and the fate of every convoy that depended on the Arctic route. The timer devices ticked steadily in the cramped interior as the men adjusted their breathing and prepared for what came next. They had reached the target. Now, they had to escape. The water around them remained silent. No vibration from the battleship suggested that anyone aboard suspected a threat lurking beneath them. The first submarine attempted to reverse direction. The commander adjusted the trim tanks and angled the craft away from the seabed. Then, a sudden current pulled the small vessel sideways. The hull scraped against one of the inner nets. The crew froze as metal grated loudly in the dark water. The submarine pitched to one side and became trapped against the mesh. Instruments flickered and lights dimmed. The crew braced themselves against the narrow walls. The commander attempted to maneuver the craft free, but the steel net held them tight. Above the water, a patrol boat drifted close. Its engines rumbled through the fjord like distant thunder. A German sentry on the patrol boat leaned over the rail. The faint glimmer of metal beneath the water caught his eye. He called to another guard. The searchlight shifted direction. A white cone of light swept across the surface. A moment later, depth charges splashed into the water with heavy plumes. The men inside the submarine heard the muffled thud as the charges sank. They gripped the rails and the pipes around them. The first explosion struck with a violent shock. The hull vibrated as the concussion waves slammed against the metal. Gauges shattered. Wires snapped. Water burst through weakened fittings. Another explosion followed, and the submarine jerked sharply as if kicked by a giant. The commander of the trapped submarine realized they had no way out. The craft could not move. The electrical systems were failing. The pressure of the water and the shock of the explosions threatened to collapse the hull. He ordered the crew to prepare for scuttling. They opened the valves that let seawater flood the chambers. The submarine sank slowly toward the seafloor. As the craft settled into the mud, the men waited in silence. Moments later, they surfaced through escape equipment into the cold air of the fjord. German sailors pulled them from the water and placed them under guard. The Germans did not yet know that the charges were already in place below the battleship. The second submarine attempted to retreat through the same inner passage. The water pulled the vessel toward a cluster of steel cables. The commander fought to control the angle of the craft as the bow dipped downward. The submarine struck the cables with a heavy jolt. The impact jammed the diving planes, and the craft began to sink slowly. Water seeped in through a fractured joint. The men inside wiped the moisture from the gauges and steadied their breathing. The commander steered toward the outer edge of the net, but the craft remained stuck. The pressure inside the hull grew heavier. The crew felt the cold air tightening around them. The commander made the only decision that remained. He ordered the scuttling equipment prepared. The men set the charges inside the submarine that would destroy the vessel and prevent the Germans from capturing it. Once the final preparations were complete, they opened the hatch and exited into the freezing water. The crew floated to the surface, where German sailors found them and took them aboard a patrol boat. The Germans believed they had caught malfunctioning foreign machines. They did not realize that both crews had already completed their mission. On board the Tirpitz, officers questioned the captured submariners. The Germans studied the wet diving suits and the small tools the men carried. They suspected the vessels were part of an experimental Allied program. They did not yet know that heavy explosive charges rested beneath the keel of their own battleship. The fjord settled into its natural stillness again. The mountains stood silent above the dark water. The men aboard Tirpitz felt no alarm. They believed the fjord protected them as it always had. Then the water moved. At 19 minutes past 9 in the morning of that same day, the first explosion erupted beneath the battleship. The blast shook the fjord. A column of water rose high above the surface. The shock ran through the hull of the Tirpitz like a violent tremor. Plates bent inward. Bolts tore loose. Bulkheads groaned. The explosion forced water deep into the lower compartments. Men on deck staggered as the metal beneath their feet shifted. The crew in the engine rooms were thrown against walls and machinery as steam burst from broken pipes. A second explosion followed moments later. The battleship lifted slightly in the water and then settled unevenly. The hull had been struck under its most vulnerable sections. Water poured into the port boiler rooms. Fuel lines ruptured. Smoke filled narrow passages. Lights flickered across the lower levels. The turbines ground to a halt as their mounts twisted under the shock. The battleship that had dominated the northern seas now sat crippled inside the fjord. Her engines no longer answered the controls. Her speed dropped to nothing. Damage control teams rushed through the narrow corridors. They sealed hatches and attempted to pump out the incoming water. They fought to contain the flooding in the lower compartments. The sound of rushing water echoed through the ship. Men worked in darkness, lit only by emergency lamps. They patched holes and placed wooden braces against damaged bulkheads. Yet the water continued to rise. The explosions had struck the machinery that lay deep within the hull. The damage was widespread. Entire compartments filled within minutes. The crew realized that the ship would not sink, but she would no longer be a threat to the Arctic convoys. As the water settled, the officers aboard Tirpitz took stock of the damage. The ship leaned slightly to one side. The turbine rooms were filled with cold seawater. The main engines were inoperable. Electrical systems were damaged beyond repair. The battleship could not sail, she could not support operations, she could not leave the fjord without months of repairs. The ship that had forced the United States to reroute supply lines now lay helpless. The news traveled quickly across the Allied commands. The Tirpitz had been struck by miniature submarines that had slipped beneath the nets and defenses that Germany believed were unbreakable. The United States understood the impact immediately. For the first time in many months, convoys could move through the Arctic with reduced fear. The threat that had forced long detours had been neutralized. American supplies could move more freely toward the Soviet Union without the constant threat of the powerful battleship waiting in the fjords. German officers interrogated the captured submariners. They asked how the craft reached the fjord. They asked how the charges were placed. The men answered with calm focus. The Germans recognized their bravery. They treated them with respect, despite the damage inflicted upon their greatest northern asset. The officers aboard Tirpitz realized that the attack had been precise. The timing had been perfect. The mission had been carried out by men who accepted the greatest possible risk. Months passed as German crews attempted to repair the crippled battleship. They worked through the winter storms. They pumped water from flooded rooms. They replaced damaged pipes. They strengthened bent bulkheads. But they could not return the ship to full strength. The engines remained unreliable. The turbines could not generate the needed speed. The ship could no longer break out into open water with confidence. The German Navy understood that the ship had become a floating fortress instead of a weapon. The final chapter arrived in the autumn of 1944. British aircraft prepared a massive strike using new earthquake bombs known as tall boys. The bombs weighed 6 tons and could penetrate thick armor. The Tirpitz sat in shallow water with her engines disabled. She could barely turn. She could not escape her anchorage. When the bombers arrived, the ship stood helpless beneath them. One of the bombs struck near the forward section and detonated inside the hull. The shock lifted the ship onto her side. Water rushed through the open compartments. The battleship rolled and capsized within minutes. The final threat that had once overshadowed the Arctic Sea disappeared beneath the surface of the fjord. The destruction of the Tirpitz began with a mission carried out by men inside tiny submarines. The charges they laid deep under the hull removed the ship from active service and ended her ability to threaten American supply lines. The final bombing in 1944 only completed what the submariners had started. The mission showed that the smallest craft could defeat the largest ship. It showed that courage and precision mattered more than size. It showed that the Allied effort, supported by American needs and American strategy, could overcome the strongest fortress in the north. The waters of the fjord grew quiet again. The mountains returned to silence. The shadow of the Tirpitz faded from the Arctic Sea. For the United States and the Allies, the path to the Soviet Union opened once more. The convoys continued toward their destination. The war moved forward. And the memory of the men who carried out the mission remained as a reminder that the fate of nations can rest on actions taken in the darkest waters by men who knew their mission would change the course of history.